and welcome to another episode of Strange Planet. All right, Beatle fans, we are about to dive deep into the Beatles' collaborations and band members' contributions to other people's music. And this book, The Beatles Fully Uncovered, is one of the most, if not the most, comprehensive examination of the Beatles' collaboration with other artists. And we're going to spend the next 45 minutes telling some great stories. Kristofer Engelhardt is here. He's the former host of Breakfast with the Beatles. He's been a regular guest speaker at authorized Beatlefest conventions in Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. And his Beatle books document members of the group's direct musical contributions to other artists' recordings. And Kristofer is considered the leading authority on the subject of the Beatles' career. And as I mentioned, the brand new one is called Beatles Fully Uncovered. Kristofer, welcome to Strange Planet. How are you?
I am wonderful, Richard. Thank you. Nice to speak with you again. Always a pleasure. So let's have some fun.
Absolutely. So just explain for those who are not familiar with your work, what they would find between the pages of Fully Uncovered. Maybe just start off by telling us what this book is not.
Um, it's not a book about people's um, personal lives. It's a book about their professional lives. It's a book about the Beatles lending their talent, their generosity, and their talent to struggling artists and to very well-known artists. Everything from A-listers to virtual unknowns. And they, if you are interested in the data regarding these recordings, not only do you get the backstory about the day a Beatle showed up in the studio to help someone record a song, but you also get all the data on the recording itself, the time of the song, composer, where the song is available, record label, title of the record, catalog number, release date, all the other musicians that played on the recording, the producers. So it's very comprehensive, not only in terms of the story, but in terms of the recording data.
And yeah, it's very sort of almost like an encyclopedia, uh,
Yeah, it's very encyclopedic.
for sure. I can't imagine. I mean, this has never been done before, right? Through except for your series of books. Um, how long did it take you to compile this comprehensive list?
I'm embarrassed to say, but and it's hard to calculate because the first book came out in 98 and I started that in around 95 in earnest. So that one was about 3 years. And then the updated one that I did in 2010 took about another 2.5 years to update. And then this current one in 22 took about another 2.5 years to update. So pretty close to 8 years. And when I say 8 years, I mean 40-hour a week, you know, full time. Get up in the morning and write most of the day, take a break, lunch. There'd be times when I take vacations or take time off, or I might work 10 or 12 hours like these last 4 or 5 months to meet the deadline. I was putting in 10, 12 hours a day, every day, 7 days a week. But early on, you go in spurts. It just depends on what's coming in, how you're connecting with people, when you have interviews scheduled. But adding it all up, I'd say there's pretty close to 8 years worth of solid work into that book.
Wow. Yeah, yeah. Beatles Undercover was the first, then Beatles Deeper Undercover, and then finally Beatles
Fully uncovered.
Fully
Yep.
Uncovered. Beatles Fully Uncovered. Um, but actually, the story's not necessarily done, right? Because as long as Sir Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr draw breath, they just love
Yeah.
performing. They'll be out collaborating with, Ringo Starr and his all-star band is, well, I guess they had to postpone some dates because
They did.
of COVID. Actually, that was the
Mhm.
second time. I think they were supposed to launch in the summer, and then someone got COVID. They had to postpone, and then they launched in the fall. And thankfully, I got out to see Ringo and his All Star band, and I know you did as well. I think you saw the
The
last
last show.
the last show before they had to pack him
Yeah.
back because of COVID. But he continues to collaborate. Paul McCartney continues to collaborate. So, I mean, maybe not enough to fill an entirely different volume, but certainly enough to update Beatles fully uncovered. But I don't know what you would call it after fully uncovered, more fully uncovered.
I said never say never after the second book, but I think it's unlikely given it seems that about every 12 years I update the book, and in 12 years I will be in my early to mid 80s and the Beatles will be in their mid 90s. So I think it's unlikely that there'll be a fourth volume, but never say never. So who knows? But and there are also some unreleased recordings out there, to be certain, that George Harrison probably contributed to, as well as John Lennon. So there's always going to be new discoveries.
Well, let's begin. The foreword is written by David Fishoff, who was, I guess, in sports management and then was
Correct.
producing rock shows. And I guess it was his idea to get Ringo Starr sort of out of semi-retirement, hooked up with a big sponsor. I think it was Pepsi Cola, and really launched this whole idea of bringing Ringo Starr together with various other artists, various iterations, some including Ringo's brother-in-law Joe Walsh, or the Steve Lukather from Toto and others,
Mm-hmm.
Edgar Winter, and starting in 1989. And to begin the book, David Fishoff tells a wonderful story that speaks volumes about Ringo's sense of humor and the sort of the sense of collegiality that he fostered with these traveling all-star bands.
Was really the inspiration. David now has the Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp. He's been running that program for about, it's where, I don't know if your listeners or if you know what the Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp is, but basically, if you aspire to play with well-known rock stars, you can, for a considerable amount of money, you join this camp at a hotel or at a location for like 5 or 6 days, and you get to rehearse and jam and then finally do a performance with a number of the guests at any particular camp. It changes. It's kind of like the all-star band, where it isn't always the same members, but many all-star band members, past and present, have participated in David's fantasy camp. But David, when he first put this idea together, a lot of people in the music industry told him that it really wouldn't be possible because there were too many egos involved trying to put a band together with all these different musicians from various musical styles and different parts of the country and the world, coming together and touring together, especially at their age and with their notoriety. They warned David. They said it really is not going to be good luck. That's basically what they told him. Well, when they were out on the road after the first few dates, Joe Walsh and Levon Helm decided to play a little joke. I think all the band members were in on this, but they decided to play a little initiation or hazing of poor David. And David was having dinner downstairs at a hotel where they were staying, and with some executive types. And I believe it was Clarence Clemens or one of the all-star band members came down and said, David, we've got to do something. Joe Walsh and Levon Helm are in a vicious fight backstage. There's fisticuffs. It's ugly. It's not good. You better hurry and come to the dressing room and see what you can do to calm this situation down. And of course, David gets up, excuses himself, and goes to the dressing room. And I think the security people and everybody were in on this joke. And David bursts into the dressing room, and there's Levon with a broken bottle, and there's Joe Walsh bleeding, and Jim Keltner's got a video camera behind a screen, and they're faking this fight, and David is beside himself. He's not aware of the fact that this is a gag. And then finally Jim Keltner comes out from behind the barrier with his camera, and the whole band members all start laughing, and David, of course, is relieved, needless to say. But that was his initiation into some of the shenanigans that go on on the road with these crazy rock stars. So that was the inspiration for him. Hey, this is kind of like camp, where you go to camp and the first day all the counselors play a trick on you. Well, that's kind of what it was. So we thought that this was a great concept to bring people into this world and have them experience what it's like to hang out with these guys who are more often than not prone to gags and practical jokes.
What is amazing, and I'm assuming that this is one of Ringo's particular talents. I'm just going to assume that he's the one that picks the lineup, but that he brings these artists together that seemingly have no common thread. So, for example, you've got at one point the All Star Band included, Billy Squire, and then on the other side you've got Richard Marx
Yeah.
coming together. It's just like, I mean, how are they going to gel? And they almost didn't. Can you tell me that story?
Well, yeah. When Richard Marx was going to be a member, when Billy Squire heard that Richard Marx was going to be a member of the band, he was very close to quitting, and he really quizzed Ringo on, the appropriateness of how is this going to work. Is this a rock and roll band, or is this a soft rock or an easy listening band, or how is this going to gel? How is this going to work? Because in Billy Squire's mind, having to perform with somebody like Richard Marx, taking nothing away from Richard Marx, a very talented songwriter and a wonderful voice, but he's not your typical Joe Walsh rocker or Billy Squire, hard edged Boston rock and roll. And but Billy decided to tough it out, and they ended up becoming he and Richard Marx ended up becoming super super good friends, and they both gained a tremendous amount of respect for each other. And I think the common thread, if there is one, is that every one of these all-star band members, all of them, have a tremendous respect and appreciation for Ringo as a Beatle, and for Ringo as a drummer, and for Ringo as a musician. And Ringo comes into the band with this attitude that I just want to be the drummer and have fun and not take this too seriously. And I want everyone else to bring that same attitude to the table as well. And I think with very, very few exceptions, they've been very successful in doing that after all these years, regardless of who they've brought into the band.
Right. The current iteration of Ringo's All Star Band, and I think they've played together before. So you've got Ringo on drums, of course. You've got the great Edgar Winter playing keyboards and saxophone. Colin Hay from Men at Work. Steve Lukather from Toto. Amish, is it Amish Stewart?
Hamish
Hamish
Stewart,
Stewart.
who
Hamish
was in
Stewart.
McCartney's band for a number of years,
Right.
the
Also,
80s,
average.
an average white band.
Right.
But that band has been together with a few minor adjustments and changes of members coming and going. But for the most part, that band has been together about 10 years. So they've kind of changed the format. Prior to that, it was always musical chairs. Each band was pretty much a new band with a few holdovers like Mark Rivera, but over the years, and certain drummers like Greg Bissonnet, he's been with Ringo now, I think, longer than any other band member. But all of those guys now, it's the one main band. So they're very comfortable with one another and they gel really well. So you don't have some of the oddities that you had in the past, like with Richard Marx and Billy Squire. Most of these guys in this band are pretty much rockers. I mean, Hamish is more jazz oriented, and Colin's a little more poppy, folky. But for the most part, when you've got Edgar Winter and Steve Lukather and Ringo in there, you've got a jamming band.
And for those who haven't been to a Ringo Starr All Star Band concert, Ringo plays some of his popular hits as a solo artist. Photograph and It Don't Come Easy, of course. I'm the Greatest, and then he'll play the Beatles songs in which he
Who's the
performed
lead singer?
vocal on, but he'll play
Yeah.
any other Beatle material, and then he'll jump behind the kit and play drums as Steve Lukather plays, Africa and Roseanne.
Rosanna or
Yeah,
Old Blind,
uh,
yeah.
and then Hamish Stewart steps to the mic and he'll perform some songs from Average White Band, and that's sort of the format. Um, and of course Edgar Winter performing Frankenstein and Free Ride. But there is a story when Edgar Winter was, I don't know if this was when he first joined the All Star Band. It's just pure pathos, really. When he was reduced to tears, not because of anything Ringo did. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, I believe it was his first outing with the band because he's come and gone several times with the band. His equipment malfunctioned on Frankenstein, and he was so upset about it that it actually brought him to tears. And of course, Ringo's the kind of guy that pat him on the back and say, "It's no big deal. Don't worry about it. It's one night. That happens all the time in show business. I mean, there's no such thing as a perfect night." And but Edgar, that just demonstrates the amount of respect that these guys have for Ringo, that they're out there giving their all, not for themselves so much as for Ringo, because they have that tremendous amount of appreciation and admiration and respect for the man.
The fact that they collaborate with so many different artists really speaks to just the fact that they just love to play. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously Ringo Starr doesn't need any more money, and Paul
no,
McCartney, one of the richest men probably in Great Britain, they don't need the money. They just love to get out there and play.
and play.
Yeah. Talk to me about when they were. And we talked about Ringo outside of the Beatles and his collaborations, but let's talk about the Beatles themselves when they were the four lads from Liverpool as a unit. They were also collaborating with other people, sometimes not necessarily to the liking of management like Brian Epstein.
That's correct. The Beatles, they admired a lot of people. And so if they ever had an opportunity, especially when they were in Hamburg at the Star Club and some of the other clubs, they would play with as a backing band for Tony Sheridan or some lesser known acts. And it was not unusual for the Beatles when they were in Liverpool at the Cavern or other venues to back other artists that were playing at those venues as well. They were opening act for Little Richard in would have been the fall of 1962. By this time, they were managed by Brian Epstein, and they had just landed a contract with Parlophone EMI in England. So they were a rising star. And when they went to see Little Richard, they opened for him. And there was a vocal group, a black doo-wop vocal group in Liverpool, up and coming friends from the black neighborhood in Liverpool, who knew one of the guys knew Little Richard and got invited to Richard's show in Liverpool. And as a result of that, got to meet the Beatles. And the Beatles took a liking to these guys and invited them down to the Cavern to see the Beatles play. And when they got there, they started to jam. And that evening, the Beatles acted as the backing band because this vocal doo-wop group, they were an a cappella band. They'd never had a backing band before. So the Beatles said, "Well, we'll be your backing band." And when Brian Epstein came down and saw this, he wasn't too pleased. He thought, "What the heck are you guys doing backing these unknowns?" And I suppose there was some degree, I don't want to use the racist term, but given the time period and the circumstance, because when this band first went down there in the afternoon to meet with the Beatles during their afternoon session, they weren't allowed in. But the Beatles pulled a few strings and said, "We know these guys, let them in." And I'm not sure that Brian Epstein, whether it was a money situation or because I'm sure the Beatles probably did not ask for any kind of compensation from this band. They did it strictly as a favor. The band was called The Chants. And originally they were called The Shades because they all wore dark sunglasses. They changed their name to The Chants, and the Beatles went ahead and got Brian Epstein to manage them for a time. And the Beatles were very supportive, would invite them to certain events in Liverpool as their guests, and were very supportive of this band. But no reason to be other than that they liked the music and they wanted to help these guys out, because obviously there couldn't have been much in the way of compensation. And I suppose Brian Epstein, with his rising stars, uh, wasn't about to just sit there and give them away to any band that walked through the door to play for free. So there was a bit of a tiff there between them. John and Paul insisted, no, we're going to back these guys. So they did for about maybe a half dozen dates.
Oh, so they didn't actually press any vinyl
With this band,
with the chance.
no, they didn't. No.
Are there any records where the Beatles, any of the Beatles, either solo or as a unit, as a group, performed with another artist, but they were uncredited?
Yeah, initially the Tony Sheridan stuff. When they backed Tony Sheridan and the recordings came out on Polydor, there were, I believe, 8 recordings that the Beatles backed Tony Sheridan on. And at the time of release, they were simply labeled, like all of Tony's bands, as the Beat Brothers. So they weren't labeled as the Beatles on the label, but they're clearly in evidence when you listen to those recordings. And of course, once the Beatles became famous, the Beat Brothers was removed and the name Beatles was replaced. So they did finally ultimately get credit. But that's the only time that the Beatles backed another artist as the Beatles, minus Ringo, because this was with Pete Best at that period in time. This would have been in 1961 and early 60, mid 62. But the Beatles, that's the only time I believe that they backed another act that got recorded and got released.
Beatles fully uncovered, and it is really it's an encyclopedia, the most comprehensive, exhaustive body of work to date, documenting all of the known contributions made by the Beatles, both as a group and individually, to the recordings of other musical artists. Everyone from Elton John, of course, John Lennon's collaboration with Elton John during the Young American album recording, and Paul McCartney recently with most recently, I guess, with Kanye and Rihanna. Well, that was 2015, but
And Canadian Michael Bublé.
Tell me about that.
McCartney had done a song called, he did an album back in 2012 called Kisses on the Bottom, which was basically his version of the American standard, you know, turn of the or mid-century songbook classics. And he went ahead and basically, with the help of Elvis Costello and Diana Krall and some people at Capitol Records, some old legends, recorded this album of standards. But he wrote 2 songs for the album by him. He wrote 2 songs for the album as well, in addition to the standards. And one was called My Valentine, and I believe it's about his his wife Nancy. And he recorded and released the song on that album. But several years later, he thought that it would be a really good album for, or a really good song for Michael Bublé to cover. So he actually reached out and contacted Michael and said, you know, I've got a song I think would really be suited to your vocal style, and I think it could be a hit for you. Would you be interested in recording it? And Michael said, which you got to give the guy credit. He said, I really would like to. He says, especially if you produce it for me.
Wow, chutzpah.
So Paul said, sure, why not? So they got together in New York, and Paul produced the recording for Michael, and that's the story behind that. There's more to the story, but you'll have to pick up the book to read it.
Right. And even when McCartney isn't performing, let's say he's just written the song, but he's composed the song. Uh, I don't know. Maybe he'll pick up a bass or a guitar, and you may not even hear that trademark, melodic bass playing, but you can still tell it's a McCartney. I mean, his fingerprints are all over it.
Yeah.
It could be the string arrangement, his trademark string arrangements, or just chord progressions. There's no mistaking a Paul McCartney composition.
No, there isn't. That is for certain. And when Paul, unlike Ringo, who's a drummer, and basically when he goes in, he's going to do one of 2 things if he's contributing to another person's recording. He's either going to play drums on it, and or he might do some vocals or backing vocals on it. But that's the extent of his contributions for the most part. He might play tambourine or clap or something like that, but it's pretty much some sort of percussive contribution and maybe some vocal contribution. But in the case of multi-instrumentalist Mr. McCartney, it could be drums. I mean, it's amazing how many recordings there are in my book that Paul contributed to, where he not only wrote the song or sings on the song or plays bass on the song or plays piano on the song, but also drums on the song. And McCartney's no slouch as a drummer. In fact, he drums on one of the Foo Fighters recordings. Now, here's a band that has two drummers in it, one sadly now, but they asked McCartney to come down and contribute to one of their recordings as a drummer because they respected. I mean, here's Dave Grohl and what's his name, Taylor Hawkins,
Yes.
both drummers. And what do they do when they ask McCartney to sit in on a session? They want him to drum.
Now, I don't know if this is an apocryphal story, but supposedly someone asked Paul McCartney one time, and this was when I think he was a little, maybe full of himself. Someone asked him whether Ringo Starr was the greatest drummer on earth, and he said he's not even the greatest drummer in the Beatles. Is that true?
It was actually John Lennon, and
Oh,
it would make sense that it would be John Lennon because that's a typical John Lennon satiric quip. That's something that John would humorously say. But apparently, yes, that is true. When they asked John, they said, "Dude, as what was that period, where they'd have the Playboy music poll or all downbeat music polls, as greatest drummer." And of course, the Beatles, were hugely popular in the mid '60s. So when those questions or those surveys were taken, George would be the greatest guitarist, and Ringo would be the greatest drummer, and John and Paul would be the greatest songwriters. So they asked John, do you think Ringo's the greatest drummer in the world? He says he's not even the greatest drummer in the Beatles. I'm sure referring to McCartney,
right,
but
right.
but as much tongue in cheek as anything else coming from John Lennon, because I'm certain John Lennon was very respectful and very appreciative of Ringo's drumming talents, no doubt. So
Right. Yeah, he doesn't get his, or maybe he does now, but there was a time when I don't think people gave Ringo Starr his due. Well, he was in the Beatles. How lucky was that? It was like, I guess, maybe being the bass player in Van Halen. Like, you just go along for the ride their coattails. But he is a fabulous drummer. And I think the fact that he's left-handed and
mhm.
by accident, that kind of created his whole style, that little, half-second delay when he's
Yep.
his, crossover and his trademark fills and so forth. Do you think, or why don't you think he gets his due as a drummer?
I think you've already stated it because I think a lot of people view him as, right, as right place, right time, luckiest man in the world. He just, timing, he just happened to be, in the right place at the right time and was asked to join this band and because the Beatles had fired Pete Best, their drummer. But in actual fact, the Beatles, and particularly George Harrison, had their eye on Ringo for quite a while. Ringo was actually the most popular drummer by far in Liverpool back in the day when the Beatles were another popular band. So they knew each other. They played the same venues together. Ringo had sat in prior to his joining the Beatles with them on a number of occasions. And Paul McCartney, being no slouch of a drummer, certainly didn't, I don't think, I think Paul was the one that probably was the least pleased with Pete Best's drumming, he and George probably. And I think Paul was looking for a change. And I think when they went for their first recording sessions at EMI, George Martin didn't care for the drumming. So they went ahead and made a change and brought Ringo in. And then George Martin wasn't particularly fond of Ringo's drumming initially. But I'll tell you something about Ringo's drumming. Steve Lukather pointed this out to me. He said, you can stripe away, you can take a Beatles song, many popular Beatles songs, and you can strip away all of the other instruments and just listen to the drum track. No vocals, nothing, just the drum track, and you can pick out the song.
Interesting.
Now,
Have you
there are
tried that?
not many. Yeah, I have. take Rain, for example, or there are all kinds of songs where if you just isolate the drumming, you know who that drummer is. And there aren't very many drummers that you can say that about. And I think that speaks volumes about just how tremendous a drummer really Ringo really is. And again, getting back to that respect that all of his all-star band members over the years have had for him. That isn't just because he's a Beatle or just because he's a someone that inspired them to go into music in the mid 60s during the British invasion. That's someone these musicians recognize as a extraordinary and exceptional drumming talent.
Absolutely. Let's take another time out. We'll come back, and I want to talk a little bit more about Paul McCartney and one of the strangest musical contributions, perhaps, of all time. And no serious Beatle fan or serious Beatle collector should be without this on their bookshelf. It really is exhaustive, comprehensive.
Thank you, Richard.
So Paul McCartney has to get the award for the most, perhaps the most bizarre musical collaboration in music history. Tell me about was it the Furry Animals doing?
Well, that's one of them, but this one is even stranger, I think, and that's the Chainsaw Song.
Yes.
Paul's children had some musical friends that they hung out with. A band, one in particular, called Nervous. The band was an English band called Nervous, and there was a gentleman in that band. His name was Justin Travis, and he recounted this story to me that they were at McCartney's house in Sussex, and McCartney has a studio nearby called the Mill, and Paul offered to allow the band to use his studio. So they were recording in Paul's studio, and they had this idea to come up with a song because if you know Paul McCartney and if you've ever seen photos of his studio, you can imagine that just about every conceivable instrument ever created is probably in that studio. So this band had the idea to grab every instrument they could and try and incorporate it into a song. And Paul happened to be in the neighborhood with his chainsaw outside clearing some brush for paths. And Paul stopped into the studio to check on how the guys were making out with their recordings. And the guys told him, well, we're doing this song where we're trying to use every conceivable instrument or whatever's laying around as an instrument to include on this song. And Paul had mentioned to him that he was just outside, with his chainsaw clearing brush. And they said, well, why don't you bring the chainsaw in and we'll put the chainsaw sound on this recording as well. So Paul went outside, grabbed the chainsaw, brought it into the studio, fired it up. Unfortunately, it happened to be a gas-fired chainsaw. So the fumes from the chainsaw set off all the smoke detectors in the studio. And the next thing they know, all the local fire departments are headed up the hill to the studio to answer to this fire alarm. So at that point, they dragged all the firemen into the studio and got them to sing on the song as well. So they retitled the song the Chainsaw Song, but it's got to be the strangest contribution that any Beatle ever made to any recording that I'm aware of.
Indeed. And the furry animal contribution, was that?
The furry animal contribution was there is a story, it's legendary, that McCartney had showed up, which he did, to a Beach Boy recording session during the Smile sessions. This was when Paul was in Los Angeles in April of 1967. And he dropped in with Derek Taylor, their press officer, who was also the Beach Boys press officer, into one of Brian's sessions for a song called Vegetables, which ended up as part of the Smile album. Well, there were numerous takes of that song, and Brian had the idea of bringing in all these different vegetables, celery and carrots and whatever you could get your hands on to munch on, and had recorded people in the studio munching on these vegetables to make munching sounds. Well, no one can confirm with any certainty whether in fact McCartney actually did munch on any vegetables that night that were used on the recording. It's kind of a 50-50, 60-40, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. None of the other participants, including members of the Beach Boys or Paul, is certain one way or the other whether he did or did not contribute munching sounds on released version of Vegetables. There are several versions of Vegetables that have been released, and if he did contribute to it, no one's really sure which one. Well, this Super Furry Animals band, Paul kind of owed them a favor because they did some mixing for him on a track. So they wanted Paul to contribute to one of their recordings, and they thought, well, every Paul plays bass on everybody's recordings or piano or sings. Let's have him, just because we don't know whether he actually ever did do munching sounds on the Beach Boys recordings, let's have him do munching songs on one of our songs. So they told him, hey, just go out and get some vegetables and munch on the vegetables and tape it, and we'll add it to this song. So that's kind of a backstory, or kind of recreating history to some extent. But that's another interesting tale.
It is indeed, and that has an entry in Beatles Fully Uncut.
Absolutely, they're both of those are in there.
I mean, is it possible that there's anything that slipped through your your attention that didn't make it in here that you're not aware of? Some lost track somewhere that
For certain.
Yeah.
For certain. It has to be. There always are. Even with this book, there were things I missed. When I did the first book, the second book came out, there were some things I missed there that were done before the first book. And there were some things in this book that I'd missed from the second book. Not because I overlooked them necessarily, but because they came to light during the interim, even though they were done prior to the release of those books. So yeah, and I'm sure there will be, like I said earlier, there are unreleased recordings that are certainly out there in George Harrison or someone else's tape vaults that exist that have just never been released. One that's documented in the book, because I do document unreleased recordings in the book that a member of the Beatles has contributed to. One by a group called the Raw Nuts, which actually consisted of Al Cooper and his girlfriend at the time, Patty Hyde, who ended up being married to Cheech Marin from Cheech and Chong years later. But they went to George Harrison's house the night after John Lennon was murdered, and Al Cooper was working on recordings for George's album Somewhere in England, and he also worked on some Ringo recordings and worked on all those years ago. But he had a song that was an old Phil Spector tune that I believe the Crystals had recorded, called He Hit Me. And he wanted George to add George's trademark slide guitar to the song, which George did that evening. And the song is yet to be released. It's never been released officially.
Wow.
But some of us managed to get our hands on those things.
Nice. I think you're frozen.
Confirmed that indeed, without any mistake, is George Harrison on a beautiful slide guitar.
I was just going to say you froze there momentarily. Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Like I said, we've been having trouble with the internet, so I don't know what's going on. I don't know what you missed, but at any rate, it's a great song with a slide guitar.
Yeah, I got most of that. Playing slide guitar. Still hasn't been released.
But it hasn't been released.
George Harrison performed guitar on, it was an Irish band. They were kind of unsure whether they wanted, he accepted their offer, and then to play on the song, when he accepted, they had second thoughts. What happened there?
Well, they were worried that, and I can understand this, even as big a name as George Harrison is, and as big an honor as it is to have him play on it, an up and coming band wants to be recognized for their own work, and they don't want to have to rely upon a big name necessarily. And they were a little worried that they would be overshadowed by the fact that George Harrison played an his unmistakable trademark slide guitar. So they were a little concerned that their song might be upstaged by George's slide guitar work, but their fears were relieved, or maybe their fears were even increased a little bit, because when they heard what George had laid down, they were astounded. They were they were so thrilled with it, and it fit so well with the song that there was no way that they couldn't allow it to go out. They absolutely loved it, but they were concerned that it might, overshadow, their work. So, and that's understandable.
Right. This was the band Ruby Horse,
Ruby Halls, yes, from Ireland.
and uh, there's a story there about. I mean, I would imagine, I would think if you had someone like George Harrison come and play on a track, I mean, it would be a huge cost. What did George Harrison charge them to play?
He said union scale, which was, I think, a joke. I don't even think he charged him that. Other times he said, "Well, you owe me a beer." Ringo's the same way. There's a video or one of the songs he played on where he says, "That'll be $3." At the end of his drum solo, his drumming bit to another artist. He said, "That'll be $3." So they do this strictly, as you said earlier, they certainly don't need the money. They do this because they like the song or they want to help out a struggling group, or they just do it out of the generosity of their heart, and then that's just who they are.
Um, in tracking down these collaborations and so forth, I mean, you had to reach out to different people. We mentioned Little Richard earlier, and I wanted to circle back to that because you tried to. We lost Little Richard a few years ago, of course, but you tried to reach out to him, maybe to get some of his input. Maybe he knew of some collaborations that you weren't aware of, or you wanted his input in the book, and he really gave you the runaround, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And, he would pretend that it wasn't him on the phone, but anyone who knows Little Richard or his voice knows that it's him. And then he invited me finally backstage to one of his shows to talk to him. And I had backstage passes and everything. And then apparently he suddenly wasn't feeling well and wasn't going to see me or anyone else. But he was kind of noted for being difficult that way. There are other great Little Richard stories that can't be told on the air that are pretty humorous involving the Beatles when they were at the Star Club in Hamburg together, because Little Richard was a headliner there when they played there in November of '62, and the Beatles were one of the other acts on the bill. Had a residency there for several weeks, as did Little Richard, and they hung out together at the Beatles' apartment and would play cards and goof around. But there are some pretty interesting stories there. And speaking of losing rock and roll legends, unfortunately, we just lost one the other day. And there's a chapter on Jerry Lee Lewis in the book as well. Ringo contributed to two of his remakes of old rock and roll classics.
Oh, on
Roll
Last Man Standing.
The Last Man Standing. Yeah,
It was a terrific album, and he
yeah,
was he was the last man standing.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Harry Nilsson, uh, John Lennon, Harry Nilsson, of course, we're familiar with the Lost Weekend when Yoko Ono ordered him out of the house, and he went to Los Angeles to hang out with Harry Nilsson. Uh, how did that relationship begin? Why was John Lennon and why were they such great pals?
Well, the Beatles were huge fans of Harry Nilsson to begin with. He had covered some of their songs. They loved his voice. If you listen to some of Harry's early albums, he had a tremendous voice, and sadly, he lost his voice over the years. But he had a tremendous voice. He was a very, very good songwriter. McCartney admired him when John and Paul came to New York in 1968 to launch Apple. They were asked who their favorite group was, and they said Harry Nilsson, even though Harry wasn't a group. So when John went to LA, he hooked up with Harry. They were drinking buddies, they party buddies. They went out and hung out. And John decided, heck, while I'm waiting to get these tapes back for my rock and roll album that he recorded out there with Phil Spector, because Phil had absconded with the tapes and he couldn't be found. John said, "Well, we're waiting. Why don't I produce an album for you, Harry?" So John went ahead and produced Harry's album Pussycats. But during the recording of that album, Harry lost his voice, never fully recovered it, and of course, that period is known as John's Lost Weekend because he and Harry were out getting in a lot of trouble in bars and in clubs and raising a lot of hell. So it's those sessions and the Pussycat sessions I remembered more for what took place outside of the studio as much as what took place inside the studio. So, and they all had a house together, living in L.A. and Malibu. So Harry had his own place, but I mean, they were all Keith. Imagine Keith Moon, Harry Nilsson, John Lennon, and a few other characters, Ringo, and put all those guys together on a Saturday night
I cannot imagine. Cannot imagine.
in the mid-70s.
You reached out to Harry Nilsson
I did.
on one of the books for some help, and didn't he tell you this is too much? This
Yeah.
can't be done.
Yeah, he said that it's an impossible task. You're never going to accomplish it. You're wasting your time and you're wasting my time. You'll never, ever, ever be able to gather all of the things that these guys have done and played on. And I kept banging on his door and banging on his door. And he said, all right. He said, send me what you got. Give me an outline of what you're after. And I sent it to him and he called me back and he says, you know what, on second thought, he said, I like what you're doing. He says, you may not be able to achieve what you set out to achieve, he said, but it's a worthy cause. It's worth documenting. And give me a little time here and I'll get back with you in a couple of weeks with to try and answer your questions. Well, in those couple of weeks, we lost Harry Nilsson, and he wasn't, the first, and he sadly wasn't the last of many people that we've lost during all my years of researching this project. There have been many who have passed away, and I would say probably a third of the artists in my book, because you've got to remember, we're going back to the 40s, people born in the late 30s, 40s, 50s. And so we've lost a lot. And so that was another reason why I felt it was really important to take one last shot at this book, Volume 3, Beatles Fully Uncovered, and try to document all of these events and recordings and to speak with these people while they're still terrestrial. So,
Beatles Fully Uncovered, Kristofer Engelhardt. Again, how do we get a copy?
You can get a copy by emailing me at 6270@charter.net. You can Facebook message me, or you can go on Amazon and you'll find my book there. You can also go to my publisher, CG Publishing's website. They're based in the Toronto area in Canada. They also have the book for sale on their website. So that's where you can get it, or any retail bookstore or any other online booksellers. But again, my email, 6270@charter.net. Charter, CHARTER, and net. I don't have to spell dot, I don't think. I hope not.
Yeah, you can find the links in the episode notes as well.
Okay, great.
Kristofer, great talking to you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Always great talking to you, Richard.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe at strangeplanetpodcast.com.